He was already there when I arrived, slumped beneath the flicker of a broken porch light, one ear torn, paws stained with mud, and something darker. I thought he was dead. The rain had pooled around him like a shroud, but then he lifted his head, just barely, and looked through the cracked nursery window. Inside, the baby stirred. There was no bark, no growl, only a silent, aching gaze. He watched like he knew her, like he'd been waiting for this moment for longer than I could imagine. And maybe he had. The glass was fogged from the inside, little bursts of warm breath blooming like ghosts. A handprint smeared across the lower pane, small and faint. She'd been pressing against it, waiting too. I remember standing there with the rain sliding down my face, trying to understand what I was seeing. The house behind me still bore the scars, scorch marks on the siding, windows sealed with plywood, but this one room remained whole, a nursery untouched. And this dog, this torn, quiet sentinel, had found his way back to it. I didn't speak. Something about the way he breathed, slow, shallow, resigned, told me words would only frighten him. So I lowered myself to the porch, knees soaked through, and waited. The baby made a soft sound, not a cry, something else, like the kind of sound people make when they're dreaming of something they lost. He stirred. His legs moved first, slow and unsure, as if the bones remembered before the heart did. He tried to stand, failed, tried again. This time he made it halfway up, before collapsing against the siding, with a quiet grunt. One paw lifted, pressed gently to the wood dot inside. The baby leaned toward the glass again. That's when I saw it. The collar. It was nearly buried beneath grime and fur, but there it was. Worn leather, cracked where the tag should have been. No name, no number, just the shape of something once loved. Something about that broke me. I don't remember deciding to move. I only remember my hands reaching out slow, palms up, the way you approach something holy, because in that moment, that's what he was, a memory made flesh, a scar that breathed. He didn't run, didn't flinch, just let me place one hand on his shoulder. His fur was stiff, cold, soaked through. I could feel his bones beneath it, every rib, every inch of hunger and pain he'd carried back here. He didn't whimper, he didn't plead. He simply looked at the window, and for the first time, I looked too, really looked. Past the frost, past the reflection of my own weary face. The baby's hand was still pressed to the glass, waiting still, and in that moment, something passed between them. I don't know how to describe it, only that it felt like watching two halves of the same breath find each other again. He let out a sound then, not a bark, not a whine, just a soft exhale, like relief, like memory, like home. I carried him inside. It wasn't a decision I thought through, just instinct, like closing a door in the wind. He was heavy in the way abandoned things are, not by weight, but by the pull of everything they've been through. My arms strained, but I didn't stop. I could feel the water soaking through my sleeves, the slow warmth of blood mixing with the rain. Still, I didn't stop. The nursery door creaked open on hinges I hadn't touched in months, and there she was, lying in the crib. I built the winter before everything went wrong. A soft fleece blanket tucked to her chin, eyes like open wounds wide, unblinking, tracking every motion. She didn't cry when she saw him, just breathed in deeper, slower, as if something had fallen back into place. A piece of the world she hadn't known she'd been missing. I set him down beside the crib. He stayed still, not frozen, just still, like a soldier back on familiar ground. His head dipped forward, nose just brushing the slats of the crib's base. The baby reached one hand down, fingers curling not quite far enough to touch, but she didn't pull back, and he didn't look away. The rain outside softened. The house creaked in its quiet, empty way. No other sound, just that unspoken presence between them, and me crouched on the floor beside both of them. not knowing what to feel. I hadn't let myself come into this room since the fire, even after they said the damage had spared it, that the blaze had licked at the hallway, charred the kitchen, torn its way through every other piece of what we'd built, but not this room, not hers. I couldn't believe it, and now this animal, this German shepherd, with ribs like scaffolding and a body torn from something brutal, had found his way here like he belonged. I leaned back against the wall, legs folded under me, the wooden floor cold against my spine. I could hear the storm fading into mist. I could hear the furnace hum and the faint whistle of wind through a broken attic vent, and beneath it all, the sound of his breath, uneven, wet, but steady. He wasn't asleep, not yet. His eyes tracked the baby's movement like a compass needle, not out of fear, not hunger, just ... watching. A kind of quiet, knowing . Something flickered at the edge of my memory. The vet had said they were lucky, that the smoke hadn't reached her lungs, that babies breathe shallow, and somehow that saved her. I'd nodded, thanked her, but I hadn't believed in luck since the night the flames came. There'd been a dog, too, a shadow through the haze. I'd seen it from the neighbor's yard where I stood helpless, sirens screaming, fire roaring like a beast. Something leaped from the second-story window, not a person. Something lower to the ground, dark fur, gone before I could be sure. I thought I'd imagined it. But now, looking at him, I wasn't so sure anymore. His fur still carried the scent of old smoke, not fresh, not acrid, but buried, like something once burned into fabric and memory. If I closed my eyes, I could almost smell the night again. The wet ash, the melted plastic, the cold metal of the crib I pulled from the wreckage. I never told anyone how close it had been, how she'd been alone for 10 minutes, how I'd gone to get milk just down the road, but lingered when I shouldn't have. A neighbor waved me over, talked too long. I told myself I was still a good father, that it wasn't neglect, just timing. But time doesn't care what you meant to do. It only counts what you did. The fire had started in the wall, old wiring, the inspector said. Could have happened to anyone. But that didn't help me sleep at night. Didn't stop the dreams. Didn't rebuild the part of me that broke the moment I saw the roof cave in from the street. She'd survived. By some miracle. Or maybe not a miracle. Maybe something else. The dog shifted then. Not much, just a twitch of the hind leg. A long exhale. His eyes fluttered closed, only for a second. I looked closer at his wounds. Deep gashes along the flank, burned scars on the left paw, a split pad on one foot, raw and blood dark. These weren't fresh. Some were weeks old, others barely beginning to scab. But they told a story. Not a clear one, not yet, but enough. He'd been somewhere, fought something, traveled far, and somehow ended up here, curled against the siding beneath a crib window, like he'd never left. I rose slowly, unsure of whether I should tend to him, or just let him rest. The baby shifted again. Her hand slid off the crib rail, landed in his fur . And for the first time, he closed his eyes completely. Sleep took him like a tide. It wasn't peaceful. His legs twitched. Once, he let out a low stuttering whine, the sound of a dream he couldn't wake from. But he didn't move away, and she didn't pull her hand back. I watched them for a long time. Something in my chest cracked open, a place I thought had calcified after the fire. I hadn't let myself feel much since then. Grief had a way of hardening into ritual, checking the locks 3 times, rereading the inspection report, memorizing the exact minute the power went out. But watching them together now, I felt something else, not comfort. Not yet, but maybe. ... A question. Who was he, and why her? Not just this house, not just any child, but her. He'd come here, to this room, like a pilgrim returning to sacred ground. I reached for the collar again, gently this time. wiped the worst of the mud away. No name, no tag. But beneath the leather strap, hidden along the inner seam, I found something, burned into the leather. 3 letters. Just initials, .K, .M, .H. They meant nothing to me, but they meant something to someone, somewhere. This dog had a history, a name, a purpose once, and whatever had brought him here, it wasn't chance, it was grief. Grief doesn't move in straight lines. It circles, loops, returns to the places that hurt most. And in the silence of that nursery, with the rain still tapping at the broken glass, I realized something I hadn't dared to admit until now. He'd been here before. The storm had passed by morning, but the quiet it left behind felt heavier than the rain. I hadn't slept. Not really. I moved between rooms like a ghost, checking the window locks, reheating coffee I never drank, watching the clock's red digits flick forward like falling embers. Each tick, another second I hadn't undone. The dog, he hadn't moved from his spot beside the crib. I'd placed a folded quilt under him sometime before dawn. Not for comfort, exactly. Just to keep him off the bare floor, and maybe as a gesture, something to say, "You can stay." He hadn't eaten the scraps I left on the kitchen tile, not even the warm broth. He hadn't made a sound, either. Just lay there breathing, twitching now and then, his body somewhere between pain and vigilance. The baby stirred around 6. She didn't cry, she never did in the mornings, just blinked, herself awake and reached for something, not someone, like she always had. A routine born from solitude, born from a gap I'd never managed to fill. But this morning, her hand didn't reach for air. It found fur, and she didn't let go. His body didn't react at first, but I saw the shift in his chest, the way his breath slowed, deepened, as if her touch grounded him, as if her presence was the one thing real enough to anchor him to the moment. I stepped quietly into the room, no need to speak. The sun had begun to rise behind the gray, fire-stained siding. A pale light slid through the cracks in the plywood nailed across her window. It landed in streaks, not warm, not yet, but enough to reveal things I hadn't seen the night before. The blood matted into his fur was older than I thought. Some of it had dried into black ridges across his flank, but there were fresh gashes, too, jagged, uneven. The kind that didn't come from a fight with another dog, not from teeth or claw. These looked like metal, fences maybe, or worse. His ears twitched when I knelt. I didn't speak, just placed a small bowl of water near his paws and sat back. He didn't drink. Instead, he looked at the baby, not at me, as if she were the only one worth watching. That kind of gaze isn't casual. It's not hunger. It's not fear. It's memory. I've seen it before in war documentaries, in photos of survivors. That look you give when someone reminds you of what you lost, or worse, what you almost lost, and barely managed to hold on to. The initials on the collar still burned in my mind, KMHID, written them down before sunrise, just to see them outside the context of pain. But they meant nothing. Not yet. Still, the dog's presence here, the precision of it, couldn't be random. There was no tag, no microchip, at least not one the old shelter scanner had picked up when I called in a favor. Stray. Likely, the text said over the phone. Big. 1, 2, hope you've got a good fence. I didn't answer. I didn't mention the scars, the wounds, the eyes I didn't mention, the baby's hand curled in his fur, like it had always belonged there. He'd begun to shift now, not away from her, but toward, just slightly, enough for his nose to graze the soft fabric of her blanket. He closed, his eyes again, like he was trying to remember something through scent. I remembered reading once that dogs remember everything through smell, that their brains store it like a library places people, entire chapters of their lives, locked into molecules in the air. So maybe that's why he came back. Maybe something here in the floorboards, in the old burnt wiring, in the fibers of that blanket, triggered something deep inside him. Something tied to this house, to her, to the way she looked when she slept. Maybe that's what brought him home. I stood slowly, knees cracking, and stepped into the hall. The scent of burnt drywall still lingered faintly. No amount of paint could cover it completely. The hallway to the kitchen was where the fire had roared hottest. I'd left it mostly untouched, since walls bare, light fixtures still hanging by a wire. I told myself I'd repair it someday, but deep down I didn't want to erase it. Grief makes shrines of pain. The backyard was half frozen when I stepped outside. Patches of old snow clung to the shaded corners of the fence line. Mud tracked deep. Near the gate, something had clawed through the earth there recently. I followed the trail without thinking. It led along the perimeter of the house, just under the nursery window. And there, pressed faintly into the soil, was a print. Not mine, not human, human, and the peacock, deep, steady, purposeful. He'd come this way, found the window, laid down, but the path didn't start here. It ended here. I turned, followed the faint imprints backward, out toward the edge of the property, and stopped cold. The gate had been open, not wide, just cracked, but the chain was broken, bent like it had been forced, and along the posts, smears of blood, fresh, dark. He'd fought to get in. This wasn't some wandering stray who collapsed by coincidence. He'd come here, chosen this house, chosen her. I sank down to one knee in the frost, staring at the broken chain. The pattern of his movements played out like a map in my mind. Entry, injuries, the line of pawprints straight to the nursery window. No hesitation, no detours, just her, back inside. I stood silently in the nursery doorway, watching the two of them. Again, the baby had fallen asleep with her fingers still tangled in his fur. His body was curled now, tighter than before. Not in pain, but in rest. His breathing had evened out, chest rising and falling in rhythm with hers, like they'd synced in sleep. And as I watched them, not as a father, not as a homeowner, but as something else, something more broken and reverent, I felt the weight of something I couldn't name. Guilt, maybe or wonder or the quiet knowledge that the world had turned inside out, and no one else would ever understand this moment but us. I knew then that I couldn't take him to a shelter, couldn't post him online, ask around, make calls, because something told me whoever came was, they weren't coming back, and even if they did, they wouldn't be the same. None of us were by the third day. They moved in rhythm, not always together, not always at the same time, but something in the air between them had settled. Not comfort, exactly, just a quiet permission. He had stopped bleeding, the worst of the wounds scabbed over by morning. I found myself studying the slow progress with the same reverence I'd once reserved for checking her chest rise and fall during sleep. Every shallow breath he took felt borrowed, fragile, but he was still here, and so was she. She didn't speak. She hadn't since the fire. Not a cry, not a babble, not even the soft vowel sounds she used to make in the morning, the kind that used to fill the room like birdsong. That silence had become part of the house now, a presence all its own, and yet with him she didn't need words. They understood each other differently, in glances, in breath, in stillness. I caught her reaching for him again, this time while fully awake. Her fingers wrapped gently around a clump of his fur, tugging once, just to feel the resistance. He didn't flinch, didn't open his eyes. He simply let her. He trusted her. I hadn't seen that in him yet. Not with me, not with food, not with water, not even when I knelt beside him to clean his wounds and whispered nonsense to keep my hands from shaking. But her, he trusted. She'd sit beside him now. Not in the crib she had learned to crawl again last month, unsteadily, like someone relearning a language they used to know. She'd lower herself carefully, knees to floor, hands outstretched, until she could lean against his flank. Sometimes she rested her forehead against his ribs. Sometimes she just watched him breathe. I watched them from the doorway, coffee untouched in hand, unsure whether I belonged in the scene or was merely being allowed to witness it. The dog hadn't left the nursery since the day he arrived. Not once. He never ventured toward the door, not even when I left it open. Not when I carried in food. Not when I tiptoed in late at night with a clean blanket or fresh bandages. The room had become his entire world, and yet I couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't resting in there. He was watching not in fear, but in vigilance, as if something could still take her from him. It wasn't until that evening, when the wind picked up again and the house groaned with its usual winter aches, that I saw him move differently. Not the way he twitched in sleep. This was deliberate, intentional. He stood. It wasn't smooth. The leg with the worst gash trembled under his weight, and for a moment I thought he'd collapse again. But he didn't. He rose slowly, shakily, like someone learning the shape of their body again after forgetting how it worked. The baby sat watching, one hand gripping the edge of the crib now, head tilted as if she knew this was something important, something new. He took one step, then another. He didn't limp toward the door. He didn't approach me. He walked a slow half-circle around her, pausing every few seconds to recalibrate. His paw pads made soft clicks on the hardwood, his breath labored but steady. Then he settled again, this time on the other side of her, facing the window. I don't know what made my heart seize right then. Maybe it was the way he placed himself between her and the night, like a shield. Maybe it was how he lowered his body not into rest, but into readiness. Chin on pause, eyes open, like a soldier at watch. Or maybe it was the way the baby responded. She followed him with her body, not just her gaze. She twisted slightly, leaned toward him, then settled beside him again. One hand rested on his paw now, and he let her. I stepped back. There was no place for me in that moment. It wasn't rejection, just a quiet acknowledgement that some things are sacred and should be left undisturbed. I found myself in the kitchen again, without memory of walking there. The lights flickered once. The hallway buzzed faintly, the old wiring still temperamental. I thought again of the night of the fire, the smell of burning insulation, the dull orange light flooding the hallway as I opened the front door and screamed her name into the smoke. And somewhere within that memory there had been a sound, a low, feral growl, not human, not kind, and then glass breaking. I had convinced myself it was the window shattering from heat, or maybe a neighbor's television in the chaos. But now, days later, watching this animal guard her from something I couldn't name, I began to wonder. I took the collar from the counter again. The leather had dried stiff. I had cleaned it gently, preserving the wear and the initials carved into its underside. KMHI. Ran my thumb over the letters again. No new clarity, just the ache of questions unanswered. The shelter hadn't had any matching missing dog reports. No registered microchips. No one had posted about a lost shepherd on the community boards. I hadn't asked many questions, only enough to feel like I tried. But a part of me didn't want to try too hard, because deep down, I had started to believe he wasn't lost. He was returning to what I didn't yet know. But the bond he and my daughter shared was no accident. It had weight. History. Or maybe something deeper than either. I returned to the nursery just before midnight. The house was nearly silent. Wind pushed against the siding. The baby had fallen asleep again on the floor, her head pillowed on the dog's flank. His eyes were closed, but his ears twitched with every creak in the walls. He hadn't let himself fall fully into sleep. Not yet. I knelt beside them, just to be near. The baby stirred once, nestled deeper into his fur. A soft sigh escaped her. I reached out, not to touch, just to feel the warmth between them, and I whispered, more to the silence than to either of them, "Who are you?" No answer, of course. But as I sat there, watching them breathe together, the wind outside softened, the walls stopped groaning, and for the first time since the fire, the house felt still. Not hollow, not haunted, just still. By the end of the week, I stopped thinking of him as the dog. It wasn't conscious. I never named him. Something held me back from that. But the shift happened all the same. Somewhere in the hush of those long mornings, in the way his body curled protectively between the crib and the door, he stopped being a stranger. He became part of the space. Not like furniture, more like light or gravity. Something constant. She had started crawling again, not aimlessly like before, but with a kind of intention I hadn't seen since before the fire. She never strayed far from him. When he stood, she followed. When he laid down, she pressed herself to his ribs and matched his breath. And when she cried, those rare, aching moments in the early hours when dreams leaked into waking, it wasn't me she reached for. It was him. I'd watched her tiny hands grab at his fur in the dark, her face buried in the crook of his front leg. He didn't stir, didn't startle, only shifted slightly to bring her closer. They never needed words. She hadn't made a sound that resembled speech in nearly 2 months. The doctors said it might be temporary. That trauma does strange things to a child's brain, they told me, not to push, that she'd find her voice again when she was ready. But something told me she was already speaking, just not in the way I expected. It was in her hands, in her eyes, in the way she leaned against him when the wind outside got too loud, and he listened in a way I never could. There's something humbling in being replaced by silence, in knowing you've tried everything. Lullabies, soft toys, nightlights, even therapy apps, only to be outdone by a wounded animal who never made a sound. But it didn't feel like rejection. It felt like witnessing, like watching 2 survivors find each other in the dark. I sat on the floor with them more often now, not to insert myself, just to be nearby. Sometimes I'd read aloud, more for my sake than theirs. The words felt strange in the room, like sound didn't belong there anymore. But he never reacted. Neither did she. They only reacted to each other. Once, I saw her lift something. A toy I thought she'd forgotten. A cloth rabbit, worn down to thread. She offered it to him. Not to play, not to chew, just to hold. He took it gently in his mouth and placed it beside his paw. It stayed there for hours. That was the moment I realized he wasn't healing from something. He wasn't recovering. He was waiting, watching, protecting. The burns on his leg had begun. Too close. I'd cleaned them carefully, keeping my hands steady, working under the slow rhythm of his breath. He tolerated it, but only when she was near. If she left the room, even for a second, he turned restless. Not aggressive, just alert, like his only anchor was her presence, and mine wasn't enough. That's when I started sleeping in the nursery. I moved an old recliner from the living room, wedging it into the corner near the crib. Each night, I sat there and listened to them breathe. It became a kind of ritual, her chest, rising and falling in that shallow infant rhythm, his deeper, more ragged draw. They kept time for each other, like 2 instruments tuned to the same frequency. It felt wrong to interrupt them, but something had changed that week. It began with a sound, not a bark, not a growl, a click, his nails against the floorboards. Pacing. I opened my eyes around 3 a.m. The room was quiet, but he wasn't still. He moved. From the window, to the crib, then to the door, then back again. His body low, tense, not panicked, just searching. She remained asleep, unaware. Her fingers twitched now and then, still curled around the hem of her blanket. I whispered his name, or rather, I whispered a name. One I hadn't spoken aloud until then. I still don't know why I chose it. Shadow. He stopped, turned his eyes, caught the moonlight. One ear tilted. Then he exhaled and laid back down. I didn't speak again. The name meant nothing to me. It had just come quietly, without force. But in that moment, It felt right. Not an answer. Just a bridge. The next morning, I found myself researching again. I told myself I wouldn't, that this wasn't about finding the past, that the mystery could wait. But I needed to know. I searched the initials again. KMH, still nothing useful. I called the shelter again, this time asking if any local rescues had reported a shepherd missing in the last 6 months. Nothing. I asked about burn victims, fire reports, vet clinics. Still nothing. But I didn't give up. I printed out a photo, the only one I had, taken in the early light one morning when she had fallen asleep against his chest. I didn't plan to post it. I just kept it on the fridge. A reminder that something was unfolding here, slowly, but undeniably. He was still watching the window. Even when he slept, his body angled toward it. The glass had long since been repaired, but he stared as though the plywood were still there, as though the fire were still burning just beyond it. Some part of him remained locked in that night, and maybe some part of her did too, one afternoon. I caught her mimicking him. He'd stood suddenly, ears forward, attention fixed on the hallway. A sound I hadn't heard yet. Maybe the mail, maybe just the groan of settling wood. But she saw him stand, and after a pause, she did too. She pressed one hand to his back. Not for balance, just to match his posture. And when he sat, she sat. When he relaxed, so did she. They moved like mirrors, and somewhere deep in that reflection, I saw something else. She wasn't just safer because he was near. She was braver, more herself. She had begun humming. Not full songs, just low, throaty notes, barely audible. But they came when he was closest, when his breathing matched hers, when the silence became a little less heavy. I wrote it down. Day 7, she made sound, just sound. But it was hers. It was the first journal entry I'd made, in months. I had stopped writing after the fire. Everything felt too fragile, too unreal. Words felt dishonest, like I was trying to explain a world that had already ended. But now, there were moments I didn't want to forget. Small things. The tilt of her head when she watched him sleep. The way his tail would twitch when she crawled too far. The way the light hit them both at sunset. Golden, soft, like memory. I don't know what kind of dog he was before this. I don't know what name he answered to, or who waited for him in the time before he came to us. But in this house, in this quiet, fire-stained nursery, he was something I hadn't known how to ask for. And somehow, she had known before I did. It began with the door. Just after dawn, I found it open, not wide, just an inch, enough to let in the cold. The front door never opened on its own. The lock caught when it shut, always had. You had to twist the handle hard to even get it to budge. I knew that, had known it for years, and yet there it was. Open, the house was still. No wind, no creaking floorboards. Only the faint sound of water ticking in the kitchen pipes. I checked the baby first. She was asleep on her side in the crib. One hand pressed gently into fur. But he was gone. The blanket he'd taken to sleeping on was still warm when I crouched beside it, heat rising like breath from the folds. His scent was strong here now, not unpleasant, just earthy, familiar. It no longer felt like the scent of something foreign. It felt like presence. A moment later, I saw him, just past the edge of the porch, beyond the low step where the concrete meets gravel. He stood still, head high, tail down, his gaze fixed on the far end of the drive. There was no sound, no threat I could see. Just the way he stood, still but braced, told me everything. He'd heard something. I hadn't. Felt it. I called his name, Shadow, still unsure if it belonged to him or not. He didn't look back, not at first. He held there for a few seconds more, then finally turned his head, just enough to acknowledge me, and padded back toward the porch without hesitation. No fear, no urgency, just conclusion. Whatever he'd sensed was gone now. He passed me without a sound, and re-entered the house like a soldier. Returning to post, the door clicked shut behind him, and just like that, the boundaries shifted. Until that morning, he'd barely left the nursery. That was his world, a perimeter of blankets, breath, and that one child-shaped silence he refused to leave unguarded. But now he watched the doors to dot the hallway, the front step, the wind that pressed against the eaves when no one else noticed. Something had changed, and over the following days, it became clearer. He began sleeping in the hallway just outside the nursery, always facing outward. His ears remained tilted toward the rest of the house. He no longer curled into himself. He lay long and low, like a bridge between her room and everything else. I hadn't taught him to do any of this. No commands, no training. I hadn't spoken more than a few words to him the entire time he'd been here. It never felt necessary. He wasn't a pet. He wasn't mine. He was something else entirely. Something older than ownership. A guardian, maybe. Or something that had once been one, and was now rediscovering the shape of that duty. The baby noticed, too. She'd crawl to the edge of the crib now, fingers curled over the railing, and stare at the doorway until she saw him. Only then would she lay back down. If he was out of sight, she waited. If he stood and moved to another part of the hall, she turned her body in that direction, her small limbs tracking his position like clock hands. Once, I tried to carry her into the kitchen with me. She made no sound, but she reached backward, arm flailing, searching until her hand caught the tip of his tail. Only then did she settle into my arms. She needed to feel him, just touch him. Even when he wasn't looking at her, she looked for him. Even when he didn't follow, he stayed close. That was the pattern of their bond, not pursuit, but presence. He began following us from room to room, but always with distance, just close enough to watch. He never inserted himself, never begged, never barked. He simply appeared. When we went to the laundry room, he waited in the hall. When I bathed her, he laid by the door. When I rocked her in the dim light of the living room, he stood at the edge of the rug, still as dusk. My neighbors began to notice. One afternoon, as I stepped outside to check the mailbox, Mrs. Halbrook from 2 doors down waved from her porch. She squinted through her thick glasses. "That your new dog?" she asked. I looked back at him, sitting just inside the open door, one paw forward, chest out. "No," I said. Then, after a pause, "But he's staying." She nodded slowly, like she understood more than I said. "He's got a way about him," she murmured. "Saw him out front the other night, just standing still under the streetlight. Gave me chills, like he was waiting for something." I didn't respond, just smiled politely and returned to the house. But her words stayed with me. That night, I couldn't sleep. He paced again once, maybe twice, then settled near the foot of the nursery crib. I watched him from the recliner, trying to put a name to the feeling that had begun to swell in my chest over the last few days. It wasn't fear, and it wasn't trust. Exactly, it was something like awe, the kind of reverence reserved for wild things, for storms, for old trees that have seen war and fire and still stand. I rose just after midnight, stepping over the creaky floorboard to avoid waking the baby. He opened his eyes as I moved past him, but made no sound, just watched. I sat on the hallway floor, let the cool of the wood seep through my shirt, and for the first time since the fire, I prayed, not to anyone, not out loud, just quietly, inwardly, the way a man does when he doesn't know what he's asking for. Only that something inside him has begun to change. Maybe that's what this was. A slow undoing, or a reweaving. I don't know how long I sat there, but at some point, I felt the warmth of fur against my arm. He'd come to sit beside me, not between me and the crib, not in the doorway, but with me. We sat there in silence, 2 sentries, 2 shapes waiting in the dark for something they couldn't name. And in that moment, for the first time since he arrived, I let myself wonder, What if he hadn't come back to protect her? What if he'd come to protect us both? By the second week, I stopped checking the door every hour. I stopped because I knew he already had. His steps were predictable now, not routine, but intentional. Every hour or so, he'd circle the house, sometimes just once, sometimes twice. Sometimes he'd pause by the window in the front room and stare at something I couldn't see. A car in the distance, a figure across the street, wind through the empty swing set on the neighbor's lawn. But always, he returned, always. He laid back down outside the nursery door, where her blanket still trailed over the crib rail, and her breath rose in soft rhythm just beyond the bars. I came to believe he wasn't guarding against danger in the conventional sense. He was keeping something out, but I couldn't tell if it was something real or something from his memory. That afternoon, I found a letter tucked between the slats of the front porch. No stamp, no envelope, just a folded sheet of paper, weighed down by a small stone. At first I thought it was a flyer, or maybe a note from a neighbor. People had dropped off condolences months ago, all of them well-meaning but too full of words I couldn't digest at the time. But this was different. The handwriting was neat, measured, inked with purpose. I've seen him, the dog. He belonged to someone once. I don't know who you are, or why he's with you now, but be careful. He doesn't forget. KMH. I read it once, then again, then a third time. The initials struck first, the ones burned into the collar, the ones I'd turned over again and again, like a riddle with no language. And now here they were, scrawled in pen, from a hand I didn't know, on a piece of paper that arrived without sound. My breath left my chest in a slow exhale I hadn't meant to give. He was watching me from the door. I hadn't heard him move, but there he was, sitting just inside, head high, eyes locked, not on the note, but on me, studying my reaction, watching like he could read my heartbeat and the tension of my fingers. I knelt, held the paper at my side. "Is it you?" I asked, my voice a whisper, more to myself than to him. "Is that who you belonged to?" He didn't move, didn't blink. I didn't expect him to. I tucked the letter into my coat pocket and stepped back inside, closed the door quietly, locked it, not out of fear, just out of habit. And still, he watched. That evening, I waited until the baby was asleep. Then I read the letter again. The phrasing haunted me. Be careful. Careful of what? Of him, of the people who had known him before. The paper was clean, no scent, no return address. But it felt deliberate, like it was meant to land here. Meant to arrive just as the air had started to change in the house, just as I had started to believe he wasn't going anywhere. I reached for the collar again, still stiff, still marked with those same initials. I thought maybe, just maybe, the handwriting would match, that some clue would present itself, like it did in movies. But life isn't generous with answers. I put the collar away again. He was in the nursery when I returned. She'd pulled his front paw into the crib, clutched like a child holds a stuffed animal. He didn't seem to mind. His head rested just beneath the mattress, his breathing steady. I watched them from the doorway, watched the way they'd begun to blur together, like two pages of the same story, slowly being pressed into one. I didn't tell anyone about the letter. I didn't post it online, didn't call the shelter, didn't even mention it to the neighbor who waved at me the next morning with that same curious glance, the one that said, "We see him, we just don't know what he is yet." Instead, I started watching more closely, not just the dog. Myself, my own reactions, the way I stood a little straighter when he was near, the way my shoulders relaxed when I heard his steps echo through the hallway in the early evening, the way I trusted the quiet more now, trusted that if anything were truly wrong, he'd already be between us and it. Something in me had begun to rest. That was when I remembered the camera, an old trail cam, something I'd bought years ago, back when I thought I might spend more time hiking. It had sat in the garage under a collapsed box of baby clothes, unopened. That night, after they were asleep, I set it up just outside the porch, angled toward the front walk. I didn't know what I was expecting. Maybe nothing. Maybe proof of what I already knew. He saw me set it up, didn't interfere, didn't even watch. Just paced once, then returned to the nursery. By morning, there were no alerts. Nothing in the footage. Just a faint flutter of leaves. One possum, near midnight. The wind shaking a gutter loose. But still, I left it up. Each night after that, he extended his route. A few more steps beyond the porch. A longer pause at the gate. The backyard, once untouched, began to show his path in the damp grass. One narrow arc that led from the corner of the fence to the back door and back again. He was mapping something, or remembering. She grew bolder, to crawling farther, reaching for him more often. Once, she tried to stand, just to follow him into the kitchen. Her legs weren't strong enough yet, but she tried. She held on to the wall, braced herself, and reached. And when she fell, not hard, just enough to startle, it wasn't me she looked for, it was him. He was there before. I could move, nose pressed to her cheek, not panicked, not forceful, just present, and she calmed, like she always did. I stood still in the kitchen, holding my breath, watching her place her tiny hand on his chest, like she was listening to the rhythm inside him. And for a moment, I didn't see the burned paw, the torn ear, the body worn thin by something I still didn't understand. I saw him whole, unbroken, and her, I saw her not as fragile, not as something I'd failed, but as someone who had been found. The house felt smaller that night, not in a stifling way, just closer, like something was beginning to gather around us. Something just outside the frame. I checked the camera again. Nothing, no figure, no car, no second letter, but the message lingered in my pocket. He doesn't forget, neither do I, and maybe that was the point. The knock came on a Thursday, late morning, bright sun, the kind of cold that carries no wind, just stillness, as if the sky is holding its breath. He heard it before. I did. Of course he did. 1 second he was lying in the hallway, head on his paws, eyes half closed but still watchful. The next, he was up, not barking, never barking, just standing at full height, shoulders taut, gaze fixed on the front door like it had spoken. I froze halfway through the bottle I was warming. She was in the high chair beside me, humming again, soft, tuneless sounds, lips barely moving, her fingers pinching oatmeal between her thumb and palm. I didn't move for a second. I just listened. 3 knocks, even, precise, not urgent, not angry, but official. I swallowed and set the bottle down gently. He was already positioned between the door and the hallway, blocking the line of sight into the rest of the house. His body didn't move, but his tail lowered, stiff and slow, not tucked, just steady. I walked to the door, opened it. The man on the porch was tall, in his 50s maybe, with a statued badge clipped to the inside of his coat and a leather folder tucked under one arm. "Mr. Callan?" he asked. "Yes," I said slowly. "Can I help you?" He glanced past me, not rudely, just habit, the way someone checks for presence and pattern. "I'm with Animal Control. My name's Rick. I'm here because of a report." The word report struck harder than I expected. It didn't register right away, like a faint sting that blooms into pain a moment too late. I said nothing, just waited. "We received an anonymous tip," he went on, "about a large injured dog matching the description of one that was seen near a recent fire investigation site. It's a routine check-in, no accusations, just follow-up." He held up both hands, palms out, the universal gesture of, "I'm not here to fight." But still, I felt my shoulders stiffen, felt the cold from outside drift over the threshold like a warning. "I'm not housing any strays," I said too quickly. His expression didn't change. "No one's in trouble," he said. "Just trying to make sure no one's missing a dog they care about." Behind me, I heard her hum falter, then stop. He heard it too. Rick tilted his head slightly. "That your daughter?" I nodded. "She okay?" I didn't like the way he asked it. Not because it was aggressive, it wasn't, but because it was soft. Too soft, the way people ask questions they already know the answer to. "She's fine," I said. "We're all fine." Behind me, I felt movement. He stepped into the edge of the hallway, slow, soundless, like a tide rising over sand. Rick noticed him before I said anything, and to his credit, he didn't react with fear, just stillness. "That him?" he asked, nodding slightly. I didn't answer. The shepherd stood quietly, head raised, eyes locked on the man at the door. No growl, no shift in stance. Just that look, the same one I'd seen him give shadows, cars, wind through trees. The look that said, "I'm not leaving, Rick." Took a small notebook from his coat pocket and flipped through it. "Any chance he has a chip?" "No. Collar. Just leather. No tag." He nodded again. "You mind if I take a picture? Just to cross-reference with a couple shelters." My chest tightened. He wasn't asking to take the dog. Not yet. Not outright. But I knew what came next. The slow process of paperwork, of inquiries, of systems larger than the bond that had formed in the quiet of my house. "I'd rather you didn't," I said. He looked at me carefully. "Can I ask why?" "Because he's hers now. Because he's mine too. Because something in him broke when the world turned to fire, and now the only thing that holds him together is the way she touches his paw when she sleeps." I didn't say any of that. "Because I don't want him to go," I said instead. Rick held my gaze for a long moment. Then, slowly, he lowered the notebook. "I'll come back next week," he said. Not unkindly, just to check in. If he's still here, I'll need to log it. That's all. I won't bring anyone else. Not unless I have to. I nodded once. He turned to leave, his boots crunching softly on the gravel path. He didn't look back. I closed the door, locked it, sat down hard on the floor, just inside the entryway, the cold from the threshold still in my knees. The shepherd came to me slowly. He didn't push into my arms, just sat beside me, his shoulder pressing gently into mine. We stayed there like that for a while, not speaking, not moving, just listening to the silence return to the house that night. I brought the collar back out, held it in my hands like it could explain itself. KMH, whoever they weren't coming. If they were, they would have come by now. Whoever sent the note, whoever wrote those initials into leather, they knew something. But they had left him, and he had chosen not to wait. He had come here, to her, to me, to this burned out husk of a home where we lived more in memory than in future. I placed the collar beside the photo on the fridge. A choice, a symbol. He stayed close that night, even closer than usual. He didn't sleep outside the nursery. He lay beside the crib again, nose tucked under the blanket, his back rising and falling with her breath. She had started saying sounds again, not words, but shaped things, pieces of tone and effort, not speech, but the blueprint of it, and they came only when he was near, only when she pressed her face into his fur and whispered secrets that only he seemed to understand. I watched them both. I sat in the chair again, the same chair I sat in the night after the fire, holding her wrapped in smoke-scented towels, wondering if grief would ever loosen its grip. And now, a dog guarded our sleep. A dog no one could explain, but somehow, we all trusted him more than we trusted anything else. The systems might still come, the paperwork, the questions, but I knew something now. He had returned to us for a reason, and I wouldn't let them take him again. He didn't come back. The next week, not on Thursday, not on Friday. I waited, in the quiet way people wait for bad news, not braced, not praying, just ready. The way a house settles when the wind picks up again, everything felt slower. Even time, even breath. But the knock didn't come. Instead, it was a letter, folded into our mailbox between a power bill and a child services flyer I'd already seen twice that month. A plain envelope, no return address. Inside a short paragraph, typed, "Cold, Mr. Callan, following up on our previous visit. Please be advised that unregistered possession of a stray or potentially owned animal must be disclosed to animal control. Per Ordinance 12-27, failure to do so may result in a seizure order. This is not a threat, just policy. If the dog is yours, complete and return the enclosed registration form by the end of the week. If not, we'll need to place him into proper care. Rick N." The form was stapled to the back. 3 pages, name of animal, breed, approximate age, origin, immunization status, ownership status, rabies certificate. There was no place to explain the truth, no field, for he came to us like a ghost. Or my daughter hasn't spoken since the fire, but now she sleeps again because he's here. No checkbox for I think they know each other from somewhere beyond language, just lines, boxes, legal silence. I stood at the kitchen counter, the paper flattening beneath my hand, and felt something shift in my chest. Not anger, not panic, but a kind of protective ache I hadn't felt since the first night I held her in the hospital. The night she came out bruised and silent, still clinging to the air between us like she didn't quite trust it. He was watching me from across the room. He never came into the kitchen, always stopped at the edge, where linoleum met wood. But that day, he stepped forward. One quiet paw, then another, and he sat by my side, pressing the length of his body to my leg like he could feel it too, the change in the air. The rustle of a threat too quiet to name. I folded the letter and tucked it under the fruit bowl. Didn't throw it away. Didn't fill it out either. I wasn't ready. That night, the wind returned, harder this time. It blew through the chimney and rattled the nursery window like fingers drumming against the glass. She didn't cry. She hadn't in weeks. But she stirred, and he was already there. He stood before the window, tail low, head up, not tense, just alert, like the wind itself had whispered something only he could hear. I watched from the hallway, watched him lean closer, nose nearly against the pane. A small sound escaped him, not a bark, not a growl, just air, a breath shaped by memory. I stepped in quietly, knelt by his side. "It's not just the letter, is it?" I whispered. "You feel it too." He turned his head slightly, met my eyes, and for the first time, I saw something I hadn't seen in weeks. Not fear, not pain, resolve. This wasn't new for him. Someone had tried to take him once, maybe more than once, and he had run, not away, but to something, to her, to this. To whatever it was that drew him back to this house, to this child who had survived fire and grief and the silence between them. The storm rattled the siding. Again, I stood and placed my hand against the window, palm to glass. Cold bit at my skin. Behind me, I heard her shift in the crib, soft and steady. And then, a sound, a word, maybe just a sound shaped like one, like a breath, a syllable, not sharp, not practiced, but intentional. I turned. She was sitting up now, hand outstretched, fingers curled toward him. He didn't move. She tried again. This time, it was clearer. Duh. Her mouth was slow, like ice thawing. But the sound held. He stepped forward, placed his paw gently on the edge of the crib, and leaned in until their foreheads touched. That night, I filled out the form, but I left some of it blank. Name, shadow breed, German Shepherd, age, unknown origin, unverified owner, left blank. Vaccination records, pending microchip, not found, rabies tag, left blank. I printed it out, sealed it, didn't mail it. Instead, I kept it on the table beside the photo and the color. The small altar I didn't mean to build, but did. A record of presence, of return. The next day, the phone rang. Unknown number. Local. I let it ring and ring, and fall into silence again. I didn't need a voice on the other end telling me what I already knew, that systems don't care about bond. That paper outweighs presence. Later, I saw Rick again. He didn't knock this time, just stood outside the gate as I walked out to retrieve the mail. He raised a hand. I didn't wave back. He didn't move. Then finally, "You got the letter?" I nodded. "You fill it out?" I didn't answer. He looked past me, toward the house, toward the shadow of movement just behind the window, a low figure rising, tail motionless. "He's a good dog," Rick said. I said nothing. "He's not dangerous, but he's not registered. And if someone does come forward, I can't promise anything." Still, I said nothing. "I'm not trying to take him," Rick added, quieter now, "but I've seen it before. Strays that get attached, they're survivors. But they don't always get to choose where they end up." I turned toward the house. "He did," I said, and walked back inside. That night, I sat by the crib again, knees to chest, heart heavy. She had fallen asleep with his nose tucked beneath her hand, and he hadn't moved since. The wind had died. The silence returned, but it didn't feel hollow anymore, just still, like something was waiting, like something wasn't over yet. It snowed that morning, the kind of snow that doesn't fall, exactly, just settles, like ash, quiet, unhurried, like it knows it belongs. By noon, the trees were coated in lace, and the road disappeared beneath a layer of silence. He was already at the window when I woke, standing, watching, not the street, not the gate, just a space in front of the house, where tire tracks faded and footprints disappeared into the white. I didn't speak, just stood in the hallway, holding the baby against my chest, feeling her breath on my collarbone. She had fallen asleep in my arms the night before, and I hadn't found the will to put her down. He turned to look at us, then returned to the window, like he knew what was coming, like he always had. I fed her quietly. She was louder now, just a little, small hums, soft vowels, a growing orchestra of half-formed syllables. They weren't words, but they were hers. And when she dropped her spoon or wanted the red bowl instead of the blue one, she didn't just cry anymore. She looked to him, and he looked to me. That had become our rhythm, the three of us, no commands, no rules, just trust. Around 2 p.m., the knock came. This time, there was no hesitation in it. 3 sharp taps, then silence. He stood, not rushed, not stiff, but with intention. He moved to the door, placed himself between it and the rest of the house, and waited. I opened it. Rick stood there again, coat zipped, hair damp with melting snow. But this time, he wasn't alone. The woman next to him was small, in her early 40s maybe, with state ID hanging from her neck and a clipboard tucked under one arm. Her gloves were clean. Her posture said polite. "Mr. Callan," she said. "I'm here on behalf of Animal Welfare Services." I didn't speak. Rick didn't meet my eyes. "We're following up," she continued, "on the paperwork you received. Since we didn't get a response, we're required to confirm the dog's status in person." She glanced past me, saw him. He didn't bark. He didn't move. He simply stood there, large, still, eyes steady. She cleared her throat gently. "We're not here to remove him today," she said. "Not unless there's a threat or injury involved. This is just a welfare check. I sent the form. I lied. Did you sign it?" I paused, then shook my head. She sighed, not with annoyance, but with something softer, almost regret. "Mr. Callan, if he doesn't have a microchip, and there's no proof of vaccination, we're required to log him as an unregistered stray, which means after 72 hours, he becomes subject to placement protocol." I felt the words like snow hitting glass. Soft, but unrelenting. "What does that mean?" I asked. She looked down at her clipboard. It means he'll be placed into county custody for evaluation, temperament testing, adoption channels. If he was involved in an incident connected to the fire, well, that may affect placement. Behind me, I heard her small voice. A soft syllable, duh. The woman paused. Her eyes shifted to the hallway, and for a moment, just a moment, I saw her expression change. Not confusion, recognition. He's bonded, she said quietly. Yes, I said. She took a breath, then looked at Rick. He wasn't aggressive. You said that, right? Rick nodded, slowly, like he didn't want to. No, not aggressive, just watchful. The woman nodded, half to herself. Then, with a gentler voice, if you can get him registered and show proof of care, we can mark this resolved, but it needs to be official. We can't ignore the report. I felt something turn in me, slow and irreversible, like a tide pulling against the shore. It's always known he's not a stray, I said. The word surprised even me. He's not lost. He came here on purpose. I didn't rescue him. I didn't feed him into loyalty. He chose this place. He chose her. The woman watched me, not judgmental, just tired. I believe you, she said. But belief doesn't write paperwork. He saved her. I know. A beat. She looked again at the child's voice, drifting from the hallway, and something in her face softened. Then, 3 days. That's all I can give you. After that, I have to log a seizure order. I'm sorry. She turned to leave. Rick hesitated. Call the shelter, he said, voice lower now. Ask for Amy. Tell her I sent you. She's not one of the strict ones. And then they were gone. The snow had started falling again. I closed the door, turned. He was still standing there, and behind him, her tiny hand reaching through the slats of the crib, fingers curling in the empty air. He walked to her, let her find him. She wrapped her arms around his neck, her body still unsteady, and he held still, until her breath calmed again. I stepped forward, sat beside them both. My hand found his fur, rough in places, healed in others, and I whispered into the quiet, "They're coming." He didn't flinch, didn't move, just breathed, beside her, beside me, like the house itself had made space for this, for us. That night, I filled out the form again, every line, every blank. I checked boxes, made calls, scheduled an appointment at the low-cost vet downtown. I found a notary, filled out an affidavit claiming custody. I didn't sleep. I didn't need to. There are nights when tiredness doesn't matter, when what you're doing becomes more important than rest. That night was one of them. The next morning, I walked him into the clinic with a leash made from my old belt. He didn't resist, didn't pull. He walked beside me, like he had always belonged, at my side. They scanned him again. Still no chip. They drew blood, gave shots, cleaned old wounds. They asked me what his name was. Shadow, I said. The tech smiled, fitting. And for the first time in a long time, I agreed. The snow had melted by the time they came back. 3 days, exactly 3. The roads were clear now, but the air still held winter in its mouth, a kind of hollow chill that lingered in the bones, even when the sun rose. He knew they were coming. I don't know how. Maybe it was the sound of tires slowing outside the gate. Or maybe just instinct, the way some animals feel the shift in air pressure before a storm. He stood before I did, moved to the front window, sat not rigid, not nervous, just present. He didn't growl. He didn't pace. He watched the road like he was watching. Memory itself arrive in a uniform. I'd registered him the day before, had the paperwork in my hand, signed, notarized, stamped by a county office that never asked too many questions. It didn't feel like a victory. It felt like a promise. The knock was soft this time, not the knock of protocol, The knock of someone who didn't want to be doing what they were doing. I opened the door before they could try again. Rick stood there, alone. No clipboard this time. No second car. Just his coat, damp at the shoulders, and a tiredness in his eyes that hadn't been there the week before. He nodded. I didn't speak. He looked past me again, through the narrow space where the hallway stretched into shadow. Saw the shepherd, saw the girl. She stood now, not steadily, but on her own 2 feet, one hand on the doorframe, the other curled around fur. Her voice was still small, but it had shape now, sound. She said his name like she'd always known it. Neither 2 syllables. Soft. Sacred. Rick exhaled, then looked at me. You filed? I held out the envelope. He took it without opening it, nodded once. No records included. He tucked it into his coat pocket, and for a moment, the silence between us held something heavier than policy. He shifted his weight. I won't be logging the original report. I blinked. He went on. I'll mark it as resolved. Misfiled. No. Further action needed. I didn't know what to say. He looked at me again, more direct this time. Whatever happened before, he said, that's between him and the past. As far as I'm concerned, he's not running anymore. I felt something in my chest loosen, not completely, but just enough to breathe. He turned to go, paused at the step, then added, without turning around, not many dogs come back after a fire. Even fewer know where they're going when they do. He left no signature, no badge flash, no reminder of what he could have done, just footprints in the snow and a door I closed gently behind him. Inside, she had pulled herself up using shadows back again. He was patient with her always, standing only when she was steady enough to follow. She moved differently now, with more intention, less caution. She wasn't healed, not fully, but she had learned the shape of trust again. That night, I lit the fireplace for the first time since the fire, not because it was cold, just because the house asked for it. I placed her blanket on the rug beside it. She sat down slowly, legs folded under her. He laid beside her, his head across her lap, and I sat across from them both. Knees to floor, the firelight casting slow shapes against the walls. We didn't speak. There was nothing to say, because the choice had already been made, days ago, maybe longer, long before I filled out the forms, before I returned the call, before I stood at the counter holding a caller with no name and decided it. Didn't matter who he had been to someone else. He was ours now, not as a pet, not as property, but as something deeper, a witness, a guardian, a living piece of the story we could never quite explain to anyone else. Later, I found the collar again, still kept in the drawer, though I hadn't needed it since the vet. I traced the initials one last, TIMEKMH. They no longer felt like a mystery, not a clue, not a warning, just history. Some chapter he'd survived to carry forward into this one. I placed it back where it belonged, not forgotten, just no longer unfinished. The snow kept falling that night, soft, steady. No wind, no thunder, just the kind of hush that feels earned. She fell asleep on the rug. He stayed beside her, unmoving, and I let the fire burn until nothing remained but soft orange coals and the sound of breath. There, breath. Hours together. I used to think healing looked like a finish line, a straight road, a clean break between before and after. I thought I'd know when it came some morning. I'd wake up and everything would be mended. No ache, no shadow in the hallway. No moments where I forgot what room I'd walked into or why I couldn't bring myself to turn on the light. But it didn't come that way. It came quieter. It came in routines that I didn't notice forming, the way his paw slid just beneath her crib at night. The way she now reached for the leash when I opened the closet door. It came in fragments, in the slow return of color to her cheeks, in the way the nursery didn't feel like a memorial anymore, in the way I stopped flinching every time the wind brushed against the window and made it creak like firewood. It was winter for longer than it should have been that year. The snow never quite left the yard. Even after the sun returned, little pockets of white clung to the roots of trees, hiding in the shadows like memories that refused to melt. I started walking him every morning. No leash, eventually. Just trust. He never strayed, even when the squirrels ran the fence line. Even when other dogs barked from behind their gates, he stayed close. He'd glance back every 20 steps or so, just to make sure I was still with him. And I always was. The neighbors had stopped asking questions. They waved when we passed, eyes softening when they saw her bundled in my arms, one mittened hand reaching for his ears. Sometimes she hummed to him now. Not songs, just sounds that followed him like invisible threads, keeping them tied to each other even when she couldn't walk fast enough to keep up. She said his name more often. Neither. Soft, almost reverent, like she knew it wasn't just a word, but something earned, something sacred. There were mornings I woke before either of them, before the sun rose, before the wind touched the eaves, and I'd walk the house in slippers, holding coffee I didn't drink, listening to the quiet. It had changed. The silence. It wasn't heavy anymore, wasn't hollow. It was full, not with noise, just presence. Her breath in the crib, his paws against the floor, the creak of the nursery door as he nudged it open with his nose, the way she smiled when she saw him, not wide, just enough to make her eyes crinkle. I stopped needing to explain it to myself, to others. There were no answers for where he came from, or why he returned here after the fire. No one else claimed him. No one came looking. The name burned into the caller remained. A question that never asked to be solved, but it no longer mattered. He was here, and she was healing, and I was breathing again without realizing it. One night, I found her asleep against his side, on the living room rug. The fire had burned low, casting soft shadows that swayed gently along the walls. Her hand rested just beneath his jaw. His body curled around her, like a question mark finally closing into a period. I didn't move them, didn't cover them, just sat on the floor beside them and watched, listened. She made a sound in her sleep, something between a sigh and a word, and his ears twitched. But he didn't wake, not fully. He trusted the house. Now, trusted the quiet, trusted me. That was the moment. I realized something I hadn't dared admit before. We had become a pack. Not in the primal sense, not like wolves, but in the truest sense, bound by protection, loyalty, shared breath, bound by what we had survived. There was no ceremony for it, no line drawn in the snow, just time and presence and the decision not to leave. Sometimes I caught myself watching the doorway, expecting something to return, a letter, a stranger, a name, but nothing came. And slowly, that absence stopped feeling like an open wound. It just became part of the rhythm. By spring, she walked on her own, wobbly steps at first, then steadier. He always walked beside her, a half step ahead, never letting her fall without being near enough to catch her. He was gentler with her than I'd ever seen him be with anything else, even when she grabbed his ears or tugged too hard at his collar. He never pulled away. He just blinked and waited and stayed. I took a photo one morning, the three of us on the front step, the light just catching her curls, his coat still bearing the faded scar where the burn had never fully regrown. I framed it, hung it above the crib, not because it marked a moment of joy, but because it marked something harder, something earned. One night, a storm returned, lightning, thunder, the kind that shakes rafters and turns windows into mirrors of your own fear. She didn't cry. She walked straight to him, climbed into her crib with the effort of a child who still remembers being small, and pulled his paw up over the rail like it belonged there, and he let her. They slept like that through the storm, and in the morning, I stood in the doorway and watched them breathe. Two shapes that had come through fire and silence and whatever lay in between. Two hearts that had nothing left to prove. And in that moment, something inside me, something that had stayed clenched since the first night I saw flames licking at the side of this house, finally let go. The house felt whole again, not because it was rebuilt, but because they had made it a home, together. The baby's breath fogged the window. The dog exhaled, and somewhere inside me, I whispered the final words I hadn't known I was waiting to say. You're safe now.